Behind the velvet voice and effortless charm that made Dean Martin one of America's most beloved entertainers lay a heart shattered by secrets too painful to bear. In his final years, the man who seemed to have everything, fame, fortune, and the adoration of millions, would finally reveal the devastating truth that haunted him until his very last breath. What he confessed in those quiet, lonely moments would forever change how the world remembered the King of Cool. Dean Martin stood on the stage of the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel, martini glass gleaming under the spotlight, his signature swagger captivating yet another sold-out crowd. The year was 1964, and Dino was at the peak of his powers, a member of the legendary Rat Pack, a movie star, and a recording artist whose smooth baritone could melt hearts from Las Vegas to Milan. But little did the audience know, behind that perfectly rehearsed smile and those twinkling eyes, Dean carried a weight that no amount of applause could lift. The world saw Dean Martin as the epitome of cool, a man who seemingly floated through life with a drink in one hand and a beautiful woman on the other arm. His partnership with Jerry Lewis had made them the biggest comedy duo in entertainment history, and his solo career had catapulted him to even greater heights. Television audiences welcomed him into their homes every Thursday night, where he hosted the Dean Martin Show with an apparent ease that made everything look effortless. Yet those closest to Dean began to notice the cracks in his golden facade. The martini glass that had become his trademark prop was often filled with nothing more than apple juice, a carefully crafted illusion for a man who was becoming increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by adoring fans and famous friends. His daughter Deanna would later recall how her father would sit alone in his study for hours, staring at old photographs with a sadness that seemed to emanate from the very depths of his soul. The truth was that Dean Martin had mastered the art of performance so completely that even his closest friends couldn't tell where the entertainer ended and the real man began. Frank Sinatra, his Rat Pack brother, often remarked that Dean was the most unknowable person he'd ever met, a man who could fill a room with laughter and warmth, then disappear into himself the moment the cameras stopped rolling. What haunted Dean Martin wasn't failure or financial troubles. It was something far more personal, far more devastating. It was a secret that would eat away at him for decades, transforming the carefree crooner into a man wrestling with demons that fame and fortune could never silence. Long before the world knew him as Dean Martin, there was Dino Paul Crocetti. Born on June 7, 1917, in the working-class neighborhood of Steubenville, Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants, Dino grew up in a world far removed from the glittering stages of Las Vegas and Hollywood. His father, Gaetano, worked as a barber, while his mother, Angela, struggled to keep their modest household together during the harsh realities of the Great Depression. The transformation from Dino Crocetti to Dean Martin wasn't just a career move, it was a complete reinvention of identity, one that would later become a source of profound internal conflict. Young Dino was a scrappy kid who learned to fight with his fists before he learned to fight with his wit. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade, much to his parents' dismay, and bounced between odd jobs working in a steel mill, boxing in local clubs, and even running illegal gambling operations. It was during these formative years that the seeds of Dean's future torment were planted. To survive in the rough neighborhoods of Steubenville, he learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to create different versions of himself for different situations. The sensitive Italian boy who wrote poetry in his bedroom became the tough street kid who could handle himself in any fight. This ability to shapeshift would serve him well in entertainment, but it would also create a fracture in his psyche that would never fully heal. The moment that changed everything came when 20-year-old Dino heard Bing Crosby singing on the radio. Something about Crosby's smooth, conversational style resonated deep within him, awakening a dream he never knew he possessed. He began singing at local clubs, developing the laid-back style that would later make him famous. But even then, friends noticed something mysterious about Dino's performances, as if he was singing to someone who wasn't there, pouring his heart out to a ghost only he could see. When he finally made the decision to leave Ohio and chase his dreams, Dino knew he was leaving more than just his hometown behind. He was abandoning Dino Crocetti forever, creating Dean Martin as a shield against a world that had already shown him too much pain. But some ghosts, he would later discover, follow you no matter how far you run or how completely you reinvent yourself. The partnership between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis wasn't just a collision of comedic talent, it was a perfect storm of complementary neuroses that would create entertainment gold while simultaneously planting the seeds of future heartbreak. When they first met at the Glass Hat Club in New York City in 1946, neither man could have predicted that their friendship would become one of the most celebrated and ultimately tragic relationships in show business history. Jerry Lewis was everything. Dean wasn't manic, where Dean was cool. Desperate for approval, where Dean seemed indifferent to it. Jewish, where Dean was Italian Catholic. Yet something clicked between them that transcended their differences. Jerry's frantic energy perfectly balanced Dean's laid-back charm, creating a dynamic that audiences couldn't get enough of. Within months of their first performance together, they were headlining at the Copacabana, earning more money than either had ever dreamed possible. But success came with a price that Dean hadn't anticipated. The more famous Martin and Lewis became, the more Dean felt himself disappearing into the partnership. Jerry's outsized personality and desperate need for control began to overshadow Dean's contributions, and the media started portraying Dean as merely the straight man to Jerry's comedic genius. Night after night, Dean would stand on stage, feeding Jerry setup lines and watching the audience's attention focus entirely on his partner. The breaking point came gradually. Then, all at once, Dean began to notice that their joint interviews focused almost exclusively on Jerry, that their movie contracts gave Jerry creative control, and that the press treated him as an afterthought to his partner's brilliance. The man who had reinvented himself to escape the shadows of his past found himself living in someone else's shadow all over again. What made it even more painful was that Dean genuinely loved Jerry like a brother. Their children played together, their families vacations together, and in quiet moments away from the spotlight. They shared dreams and fears with an intimacy that few friendships ever achieve. But love wasn't enough to overcome the growing resentment and professional frustration that was eating Dean alive from the inside. The final confrontation happened on July 25, 1956, at the Copa Room in the Sands Hotel, the same stage where Dean would later achieve his greatest solo triumphs. After their last show together, Dean told Jerry with characteristic brevity, "That's it, we're through." Jerry reportedly broke down and begged Dean to reconsider, but Dean's mind was made up. The partnership that had made them both wealthy and famous was over, leaving behind a wound that would never fully heal for either man. After the devastating end of his partnership with Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin found himself adrift in Hollywood, unsure of who he was without half of the most successful comedy duo in entertainment history. Critics predicted his career was over, that he was nothing without Jerry's manic energy to bounce off of. But fate had other plans, and those plans involved a skinny kid from Hoboken named Frank Sinatra, who was staging his own remarkable comeback after his career had nearly flatlined in the early 1950s. The Rat Pack wasn't just a group of entertainers who happened to be friends. It was a carefully orchestrated family of choice, bound together by shared experiences of triumph, heartbreak, and the unique pressures of life in the public eye. Frank Sinatra served as the undisputed leader, but Dean quickly became his most trusted lieutenant, the one man who could match Frank's cool confidence without challenging his authority. What drew these men together wasn't just their love of performing, drinking, and carousing. It was their shared understanding of what it meant to reinvent yourself in America. Frank had clawed his way back from professional oblivion. Sammy Davis Jr. had overcome racial barriers that would have crushed a lesser man, and Dean had successfully escaped the shadow of his former partnership to establish himself as a formidable solo act. The brotherhood they formed in the smoky lounges and neon-lit stages of Las Vegas gave Dean something he had been searching for his entire adult life: unconditional acceptance. With the Rat Pack, he didn't have to be the straight man or the second banana. He was Dean Martin, and that was enough. Frank respected his talent. Sammy marveled at his natural charisma, and the others looked up to him as an elder brother figure. But even surrounded by this brotherhood, Dean carried secrets that he couldn't share with anyone. Late at night, after the shows were over and the parties had wound down, he would retreat to his suite at the Sands and sit alone with his thoughts, nursing a real drink this time, wondering if the happiness he felt with his Rat Pack brothers was genuine or just another performance. The truth was that Dean had become so good at being what others needed him to be that he was losing touch with who he really was underneath it all. The Rat Pack years were undoubtedly the most fun and successful of his career, but they also marked the beginning of a deeper isolation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Even surrounded by the best friends a man could ask for, Dean Martin was still, in many ways, alone with his ghosts. Dean Martin's romantic life read like a Hollywood script: beautiful leading ladies, passionate affairs, and marriages that began with fairy tale promise but ended in heartbreak and regret. Yet beneath the glamorous headlines and gossip column speculation lay a pattern of emotional distance that would define not just his relationships with women, but his relationship with love itself. His first marriage to Elizabeth Ann MacDonald in 1941 was the union of two young dreamers who had no idea what fame would cost them. Betty, as she was known, was a sweet Ohio girl who fell in love with Dino Crocetti, not Dean Martin. She bore him for children Craig, Claudia, Gail, and Deanna tried valiantly to maintain a normal family life as her husband's career skyrocketed to unimaginable heights. But fame is a cruel mistress, and it demanded more of Dean than he had to give. The constant touring, the late-night recording sessions, and the social obligations of being a major star meant that he was rarely home, and when he was often emotionally absent. Betty would later confess to friends that she felt like she was married to a ghost. Dean's body might be there, but his mind and heart were always somewhere else. The divorce in 1949 wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the first major crack in Dean's carefully constructed emotional armor. He had failed at the one thing that mattered more than career success, being present for the people who loved him unconditionally. The guilt of leaving his children, of choosing his career over his family, would haunt him for the rest of his life. His second marriage to Jean Bigger in 1950 was supposed to be his redemption story. Jean was sophisticated, understanding of the entertainment business, and seemingly perfect for a man of Dean's stature. She gave him 3 more children, Dean, Paul, Richie, and Gina, and created a stable home environment that allowed him to flourish professionally. For a while, it seemed like Dean had found the perfect balance between career and family. Jean understood the demands of his profession and didn't ask him to be something he couldn't be. But even this understanding marriage couldn't bridge the emotional distance that Dean had learned to maintain as a survival mechanism. He was a loving father and a faithful husband, but there was always a part of himself that remained locked away, inaccessible even to those closest to him. The pattern would repeat itself once more with his third marriage to Catherine Hahn in 1973, a union that lasted only 3 years but left Dean more isolated than ever. Each failed relationship wasn't just a personal disappointment, it was confirmation of his deepest fear, that he was fundamentally incapable of the kind of emotional intimacy that makes love last. By the 1960s, Dean Martin had achieved something that few entertainers ever manage. He had become an icon, a cultural symbol of effortless cool that transcended mere celebrity. His image was everywhere, on album covers, movie posters, and television screens across America. He was the man every guy wanted to be, and every woman wanted to be with. But the price of maintaining this image was slowly killing the man behind it. The Dino persona that had made him famous was becoming a prison. Every public appearance, every interview, every casual encounter with fans required him to be on, to embody the laid-back, martini-sipping, devil-may-care character that the world expected. The problem was that this character was increasingly at odds with who Dean Martin really was. Underneath it all, those closest to him began to notice the toll this constant performance was taking. His children would later recall how their father could flip a switch, transforming from a quiet, introspective man into the larger-than-life Dean Martin the moment someone knocked on the door or the phone rang. It was a masterful performance, but it was still a performance. And performances require enormous emotional energy to sustain. The irony wasn't lost on Dean that he had become trapped by his own success. The very qualities that had made him famous, effortless charm, the apparent indifference to criticism, the ability to make everything look easy, were now expected of him every moment of every day. He couldn't have a bad day, couldn't show weakness, couldn't admit that sometimes the weight of carrying everyone else's expectations was crushing him. His drinking, which had started as a prop and later became a moderate social habit, began to increase during this period. Not to the extent that it interfered with his performances. Dean was too much of a professional for that, but enough that those who knew him best began to worry. The man who had built his career on appearing relaxed and carefree was using alcohol to actually achieve the state that everyone assumed came naturally to him. The saddest part was that Dean's natural personality, his genuine warmth, his quick wit, his deep capacity for loyalty and love was actually more appealing than the manufactured persona he felt compelled to maintain. But by this point, he had been performing Dean Martin for so long that he was losing touch with who Dino Crocetti had been before the fame, before the expectations, before the world decided who he was supposed to be. Of all the children Dean Martin fathered across his 3 marriages, none held a more special place in his heart than Dean Paul Martin Jr., known to the family as Dino Jr., born in 1951 during Dean's marriage to Jean. Dino Jr. was everything his famous father had dreamed his son would be: handsome, talented, charismatic, and blessed with the same effortless charm that had made Dean a star. Unlike his other children, who had learned to navigate the unique challenges of growing up as Dean Martin's offspring, Dino Jr. seemed destined to carry on the family legacy. He was a gifted athlete, excelling at tennis with professional-level skill, and showed early promise as a performer. More importantly, he possessed something that Dean recognized as precious because he had lost it himself: an uncomplicated joy in living, the ability to be present in the moment without the emotional barriers that had defined his father's adult life. Dean saw in his son a chance at redemption, an opportunity to give someone the unconditional love and emotional availability that he had struggled to provide to his other children and wives. He poured himself into Dino Jr. as life in ways that surprised those who knew him best, attending tennis matches, offering career guidance, and sharing quiet moments of father-son bonding that revealed a side of Dean Martin the public never saw. Dino Jr. was also struggling with the weight of carrying his father's name and legacy. The pressure to live up to the Martin family reputation, combined with the natural rebelliousness of youth, led him to seek his own path, one that would ultimately prove tragic. In the 1980s, he joined the California Air National Guard, finding in military service a sense of purpose and identity that existed entirely separate from his father's fame. Flying became Dino Jr.'s passion, his escape from the complicated world of being Dean Martin's son. In the cockpit of an F-4 Phantom, He wasn't a celebrity offspring or a potential heir to an entertainment dynasty. He was simply Captain Dean Paul Martin, a skilled pilot serving his country. For the first time in his life, he had found something that was entirely his own. Dean was initially concerned about his son's military service, but he came to respect and admire Dino Jr.'s dedication to his duty. Here was a young man who had chosen service over the easy path of trading on his father's name, who had found his own way to make a difference in the world. For a father who had always questioned his own worth beyond entertainment, his son's noble choice filled him with pride and hope for the future. The call came on March 21, 1987. While Dean was at home in Beverly Hills, Dino Jr. SF for Phantom had crashed into the San Bernardino Mountains. During a routine training flight in bad weather, there were no survivors. In an instant, the light went out of Dean Martin's world, never to be rekindled. The death of Dean Paul Martin, Jr. didn't just break his father's heart, it shattered the very foundation of who Dean Martin was as a man. Those who knew him before March 21, 1987, and those who knew him after would swear they were dealing with two completely different people. The vibrant, charismatic entertainer who had lit up stages for 4 decades was replaced by a hollowed-out shell of a man who seemed to be going through the motions of living. The first sign that something fundamental had changed came at Dino Jr.'s funeral. Dean, who had spent a lifetime perfecting his public persona, stood at his son's graveside with tears streaming down his face, making no attempt to hide his devastation. The man who had always appeared unflappable, who had made a career out of seeming like nothing could touch him, was revealed to be as vulnerable and heartbroken as any father who had lost a child. Frank Sinatra and the surviving members of the Rat Pack rallied around their friend, but even their legendary bond couldn't penetrate the wall of grief that had descended around Dean. He went through the motions of his scheduled performances for a few months after the tragedy, but anyone who watched him could see that he was simply marking time, fulfilling obligations while his spirit remained buried with his son. The breaking point came during a Rat Pack reunion tour later that year. Dean, who had never missed a performance in his professional career, walked off the stage in the middle of a show, telling Frank simply, "I can't do this anymore." It was the last time he would perform with his old friends. The end of an era that had defined Las Vegas entertainment for decades. What hurt almost as much as the loss itself was the realization that all his success, all his fame and fortune, meant nothing in the face of this grief. He was Dean Martin, one of the biggest stars in the world, but he couldn't sing away the pain, couldn't charm death into giving his son back, couldn't perform his way out of the darkness that had settled over his life. His other children watched helplessly as their father retreated further and further into himself. The man who had always been emotionally distant became almost completely unreachable, spending his days in his study, staring at photographs of Dino Jr. and replaying their last conversations in his mind. The gregarious entertainer who had thrived on human connection now seemed to find other people's presence almost unbearable. Dean began drinking more heavily, not for the social lubrication it had once provided, but as a way to numb the constant ache in his chest. He stopped returning phone calls from old friends, declined social invitations, and gradually withdrew from the world that had once adored him. The king of cool had been dethroned by grief, and he seemed to have no interest in reclaiming his crown. The sprawling Beverly Hills mansion that had once been the site of legendary parties and gatherings became Dean Martin's self-imposed prison. In his final years, the man who had once effortlessly commanded stages and charmed millions retreated behind the iron gates of his estate, emerging only for the most essential activities. The transformation was so complete that longtime friends began referring to him as the Hermit of Beverly Hills. The house itself seemed to reflect Dean's emotional state. Once immaculately maintained and filled with the sounds of laughter and music, it now felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Staff members reported that Dean would spend entire days in his study, surrounded by photographs and memorabilia from his career, but focusing almost exclusively on pictures of his deceased son. The gold records and movie posters that had once been sources of pride now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. His daily routine became increasingly minimal and ritualistic. He would wake late, have coffee while reading the newspaper, though friends noted he rarely seemed to actually absorb what he was reading, and then retreat to his study, where he would sit for hours without speaking to anyone. Meals were often forgotten entirely, and when he did eat, it was usually alone, standing at the kitchen counter rather than sitting at the dining room table that had once hosted so many memorable gatherings. The few visitors he did allow were struck by how much he had changed. Dean's famous smile, which had once seemed as natural as breathing, now appeared only in brief, forced moments when politeness demanded it. His conversation, once filled with wit and charm, became monotonous and distant. It was as if the part of him that had connected with other human beings had been buried along with Dino Jr. Most heartbreaking of all was his relationship with his surviving children and grandchildren. These people who loved him most in the world found themselves dealing with a man who seemed to be physically present but emotionally absent. He would go through the motions of holiday gatherings and birthday celebrations, but everyone could see that he was simply enduring these events rather than participating in them. His daughter, Deanna, would later write about visiting her father during this period and feeling like she was talking to a ghost. The man who had raised her, who had been distant at times but always fundamentally loving, had been replaced by someone who seemed to be counting the days until he could join his son. It was a level of despair that no amount of professional counseling or family support seemed able to penetrate. The entertainment industry, which had once clamored for Dean Martin's attention, gradually learned to leave him alone. Offers for comebacks, tribute shows, and retrospective interviews went unanswered. The man who had spent 50 years in the spotlight had finally found the privacy he had always claimed to want. But it was a privacy born of grief rather than choice, and it was slowly killing him that as the years passed in his self-imposed exile, Dean Martin found himself haunted not just by the loss of his son, but by the accumulation of all the relationships he had kept at arm's length, all the moments of genuine intimacy he had avoided, and all the love he had been too afraid to fully give or receive. The very emotional distance that had protected him throughout his career now felt like a cruel joke. He had spent so much time guarding his heart that he had forgotten how to open it, even to those who mattered most. Late at night, alone in his study with only a bottle of Jack Daniels for company, Dean would find himself reliving moments from his past with startling clarity. He remembered the hurt in Betty's eyes when he chose another recording session over their anniversary dinner. He could still see Jerry Lewis's face the night they dissolved their partnership. The confusion and betrayal of a man who had considered Dean not just a business partner, but a brother. The memories that tormented him most were the small moments with his children that he had missed, or dismissed as unimportant at the time. Dino Jr.'s Little League games that he had skipped for television appearances, Deanna's piano recitals that had conflicted with recording sessions, Gail's graduation that he had attended but spent mostly thinking about work. Each missed opportunity now felt like a betrayal of what should have been his highest priority. He began to understand that his legendary cool had been both his greatest asset and his most devastating weakness. The emotional detachment that had made him so appealing to audiences had also made him incapable of the kind of deep, vulnerable connection that gives life meaning. He had been so afraid of being hurt that he had never allowed himself to be truly known, even by those who loved him unconditionally. The realization that came to Dean in these dark nights of the soul was perhaps the most painful of all. He had wasted his life, not his career that had been a remarkable success by any measure, but his actual life, the private moments and personal relationships that determine whether a person's time on earth has been worthwhile. He had achieved everything he had dreamed of as young Dino Crocetti in Steubenville, but he had lost himself in the process. What made it even more tragic was that Dean finally understood what he should have done differently. But it was too late to change any of it. He was in his 70s. His health was failing, and most of the people he had pushed away were either dead or had moved on with their lives. The man who had spent decades running from emotional intimacy now desperately craved it, but found himself alone with his regrets and his whiskey. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had become everything he had feared as a young man, bitter and consumed by regret. The boy from Ohio who had dreamed of escape had gotten exactly what he had wished for, a complete escape from Dino Crocetti. But in becoming Dean Martin, he had lost not just his name, but his soul. The end of Dean Martin's friendship with Frank Sinatra represented more than just the dissolution of a professional relationship. It was the final severing of Dean's last meaningful human connection. The closing of a chapter that had defined the greatest years of his life. The man who had once been closer than a brother to Dean now became a painful reminder of everything he had lost, not just in terms of his son, but in terms of his ability to maintain any kind of meaningful relationship. The troubles began in the aftermath of Dino Jr.'s death, when Frank, in his characteristic way of trying to help, attempted to pull Dean out of his grief through work and social obligations. Frank believed, perhaps naively, that returning to the stage and the camaraderie of performance would help heal his friend's broken heart. He organized the reunion tour with Sammy Davis Jr., convinced that the magic of their old chemistry would rekindle Dean's desire to live. But Dean was no longer the man who had stood beside Frank through decades of triumph and scandal. The grief had changed him fundamentally, and Frank's well-intentioned efforts to fix him felt like an assault on his right to mourn. When Frank pressured him to continue the tour after Dean had clearly expressed his desire to stop performing, it created a rift that would never heal. The final confrontation happened backstage in Chicago, where Dean had walked off in the middle of a performance. Frank, frustrated and hurt by what he saw as his friend's abandonment of their partnership and their audience, said things that cut Dean to the core. Words about responsibility, about letting down the fans, about dishonoring their friendship, words that Frank probably regretted the moment they left his mouth, but which Dean heard as confirmation of his worst fears about himself. Dean's response was typically understated but devastating in its finality. "Frank, I'm done." With all of it, he meant the tour, the performances, the public persona. But Frank, heard it as a personal rejection of their decades-long friendship. In a way, both interpretations were correct. Dean was walking away from everything that had defined his adult life, and that included his relationship with the man who had been his closest friend. The tragedy was that both men were acting out of love. Frank's desperate attempt to save his friend, and Dean's equally desperate need to honor his grief without having to perform for anyone, even those closest to him. But their different ways of processing loss made them incompatible in a way they had never been before. Frank's instinct was to keep moving, to distract himself with work and social obligations. Dean's instinct was to stop everything and sit with his pain until he understood it. The entertainment world watched in stunned silence as two of its greatest legends essentially excommunicated each other. There were no public statements, no dramatic confrontations reported in the press. Just a gradual acknowledgement that the friendship that had once been unbreakable had quietly, sadly, ended. Frank continued performing until his health failed. But those who knew him best said he never quite got over losing Dean, not just as a performer, but as the one person who had never needed anything from him except his friendship. For Dean, the loss of Frank's friendship was yet another confirmation that he was destined to end up alone. The man who had once surrounded himself with the most charismatic and loyal friends in Hollywood now faced his final years with no one to call, no one who truly understood the depth of his despair, no one who had known him before he became famous, enough to matter to anyone. In the winter of 1995, with his health failing and his world reduced to the confines of his Beverly Hills mansion, Dean Martin finally found the courage to confront the truth he had been running from his entire adult life. The confession came not to a priest or a therapist, but to his daughter Deanna, during one of her increasingly frequent visits to check on her increasingly frail father. It happened on a particularly difficult evening when Dean, weakened by years of heavy drinking and emotional neglect of his health, was struggling with a bout of pneumonia that would ultimately contribute to his death. As Deanna sat beside his bed, trying to coax him to eat some soup, he suddenly looked at her with a clarity that had been absent from his eyes for years. "I never knew how to love anyone properly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with the pain that seemed to come from the very center of his being. "Not your mother, not Jerry, not Frank, not even you kids. I was so afraid of being hurt that I never let myself care about anyone the way they deserved to be cared about." The words hung in the air like a final judgment on a life spent in emotional hiding. Deanna later said that in that moment, she saw not Dean Martin, the legend, but Dino Crocetti, the frightened little boy who had learned too early that caring too much about people meant risking devastating loss. The success, the fame, the fortunate, had all been an elaborate defense mechanism against the kind of vulnerability that makes life worth living. But the confession didn't end there. Over the following weeks, as Dean's health continued to deteriorate, he began to reveal the depth of his self-awareness about what his life had become. He understood that his legendary cool had been a prison of his own making, that his ability to remain detached had cost him everything that really mattered. Most heartbreaking of all was his admission about Dino Jr.'s death. "I finally found the courage to love someone completely," he told Deanna, tears streaming down his weathered face, "and God took him away from me. Maybe that's my punishment for all the love I was too scared to give to everyone else." The guilt he carried wasn't just about his son's death, it was about a lifetime of emotional absence, of choosing the safety of distance over the risk of intimacy. He spoke about moments with each of his children when they had needed him to be present, really present, and he had been physically there but emotionally somewhere else. He talked about his wives, each of whom had deserved a husband who could give himself completely to the marriage. What made the confession even more tragic was that it revealed Dean's profound understanding of what he had lost. He wasn't a man who had lived carelessly without realizing the consequences. He was a man who had made deliberate choices to protect himself emotionally, and who now understood exactly what those choices had cost him and everyone who had loved him. The final revelation came just days before his death. "I spent my whole life being afraid of ending up alone, and that's exactly what happened. The thing I was most afraid of became the only thing that was left." Christmas 1995 was supposed to be different. For the first time in years, Dean Martin had agreed to have his entire family gather at the Beverly Hills mansion for the holidays. His children and grandchildren had been planning for weeks, hoping that this might finally be the breakthrough they had been praying for. The moment when their father and grandfather would emerge from his grief-induced exile and rejoin the living. House staff had decorated the mansion more elaborately than it had been since Dino Jr.'s death. A towering Christmas tree stood in the living room, surrounded by carefully wrapped presents. The kitchen was prepared to create the kind of feast that had once been a Martin family tradition. Everything was ready for what everyone hoped would be a healing celebration, but Dean's health had been declining rapidly throughout December. The pneumonia that had weakened him earlier in the month had evolved into a more serious respiratory condition, and his doctor had begun making daily visits to the mansion. Still, Dean insisted that the family gathering would go on as planned. He seemed determined to give his loved ones one last Christmas together, even if he couldn't fully participate in it. On Christmas Eve, as family members began arriving at the mansion, Dean made what would be his final public appearance of sorts. Dressed in his favorite robe and slippers, he came downstairs to greet his children and grandchildren, managing a smile that, while weak, carried echoes of the charm that had once captivated millions. For a brief moment, those present later recalled, it felt like the old Dean might be returning to them. He sat in his favorite armchair, surrounded by the people who loved him most, and for the first time in years, he seemed genuinely present for the conversation. He asked his grandchildren about school, complimented his daughters on their appearances, and even managed a few of the gentle jokes that had once been his trademark. It was as if he was using every ounce of his remaining strength to give his family this gift. One last glimpse of the man he had been before grief consumed him, but the effort was too much for his weakened system. By Christmas morning, Dean was confined to his bed, breathing with difficulty and drifting in and out of consciousness. The family gathered around him, taking turns holding his hand and sharing favorite memories. But they could all see that he was letting go. The man who had spent the last 8 years counting the days.